Close your eyes tonight and let me take you back more than 7 centuries, to a time when the world trembled at the sound of thundering hooves across endless plains. Picture, if you will, the year 1260, when two of history's most formidable military powers collided in the sands of Palestine, in a battle that would forever change the course of human civilization. The Mongol Empire stretched like a vast shadow across the known world, from the frozen steppes of Siberia to the sun-baked deserts of Mesopotamia. Their mounted archers had swept away kingdoms like autumn leaves before a hurricane, leaving behind a trail of conquered cities and humbled emperors. For nearly 6 decades, no army had truly stopped their relentless advance. They seemed unstoppable, inevitable, like a force of nature itself. But in the golden city of Cairo, along the life-giving waters of the Nile, another power was rising. The Mamluks, warriors born not of noble blood, but forged in the crucible of slavery and military training, had seized control of Egypt and established themselves as the new masters of the ancient land of the pharaohs. These were men who had known bondage, who had earned their freedom through skill at arms and unwavering loyalty to their brotherhood. Tonight, as you settle into the comfort of your bed, let me tell you the extraordinary story of how these warrior slaves faced down the greatest military machine the world had ever seen, and in doing so, saved not just their own kingdom, but perhaps all of Western civilization from Mongol conquest. Our tale begins not with the clash of swords or the thunder of cavalry charges, but with understanding. To truly appreciate the magnitude of what happened in that fateful year of 1260, we must first understand who these Mamluks were, and why their victory over the seemingly invincible Mongols was nothing short of miraculous. The word Mamluk itself carries a profound irony that would shape the destiny of the medieval world. In Arabic, it simply means owned or slave. Yet these men who began their lives in bondage would rise to become some of history's most feared and respected warriors, creating a military elite that would rule Egypt and much of the Levant for over 2 centuries. The Mamluk system had its origins in the wisdom of earlier Muslim rulers who recognized a fundamental truth about power: that loyalty born of gratitude and shared experience often proved stronger than loyalty born of blood or tribal ties. Beginning in the 9th century, Muslim caliphs and sultans had begun purchasing young boys, typically from the Turkish steppes, the Caucasus Mountains, and the regions around the Black Sea, to serve as their personal guards and elite soldiers. These were not the broken slaves of popular imagination, toiling in fields or mines. Instead, they were carefully selected for their potential. Young men, usually between the ages of 10 and 14, chosen for their physical prowess, intelligence, and most importantly, their lack of existing tribal or family loyalties that might conflict with service to their new masters. Picture these young warriors in training in the barracks of 13th century Cairo. The morning sun streams through latticed windows as they practice their swordplay in the courtyard, their movements growing more fluid and deadly with each passing day. They learn not just the arts of war, but also statecraft, Islamic law, and the subtle diplomacy required to govern vast territories. They form bonds with their fellow Mamluks that transcend the typical relationships of soldiers. These become brotherhoods forged in shared hardship and common purpose. By the 13th century, the Ayyubid dynasty, founded by the great Saladin, had relied heavily on these Mamluk warriors to maintain their empire, which stretched from Egypt through Syria and into parts of Mesopotamia. The Ayyubids understood that the Mamluks represented a nearly perfect military solution. Highly skilled, utterly loyal to their commanders rather than to competing political factions, and with no local family ties that might divide their allegiances. But the Ayyubids had perhaps succeeded too well in creating this military elite. By 1250, the Mamluks had grown so powerful and confident that they began to question why they should serve masters who were, in many cases, less skilled in warfare and statecraft than they themselves had become. When the last effective Ayyubid Sultan, As-Salih Ayyub, died in 1249, followed shortly by his son and heir, the Mamluks saw their opportunity. In a carefully orchestrated coup that demonstrated both their military precision and political acumen, the Mamluks seized control of Egypt. Their leader, a brilliant commander named Aibek, became the first Mamluk Sultan, establishing a new dynasty that would endure for centuries. But Aibek's reign would be brief, and by 1260, the Mamluk throne was occupied by a man whose name would become legendary in the annals of military history: Saif ad-Din Qutuz. Qutuz was everything a Mamluk sultan should be. Born into slavery like his predecessors, he had risen through the ranks through a combination of martial skill, strategic brilliance, and the kind of charismatic leadership that inspired absolute devotion from his followers. He understood that the Mamluk system's greatest strength lay not in individual prowess, though that was certainly formidable, but in the collective identity and shared purpose of the Mamluk Brotherhood. Under Qutuz's leadership, the Mamluks had transformed Egypt into a military powerhouse. Their training regimens were legendary in their intensity and comprehensiveness. A Mamluk warrior was not merely a skilled horseman or archer. He was a master of multiple weapons, a student of tactics and strategy, and a member of an elite brotherhood that valued honor and martial excellence above all else. But in 1260, all of this military prowess was about to face its ultimate test. From the east, like a storm gathering on the horizon, came news that struck fear into the hearts of rulers from Baghdad to Paris. The Mongols were coming. To understand the magnitude of the Mamluk achievement in 1260, you must first appreciate what they faced. The Mongol Empire was not simply another medieval kingdom seeking to expand its borders. It was a military phenomenon unlike anything the world had ever seen. A perfectly coordinated war machine that had conquered territories stretching from China to Eastern Europe. The Mongols' success was built on a revolutionary approach to warfare that combined mobility, psychological terror, and organizational brilliance. At the heart of their military system was the composite bow, a masterpiece of medieval engineering that could send arrows with deadly accuracy over distances that seemed impossible to their enemies. A skilled Mongol archer could loose arrows with devastating effect while riding at full gallop, turning every warrior into a mobile artillery unit. But the Mongols' true genius lay not in any single weapon or tactic, but in their complete reimagining of how warfare should be conducted. Where medieval armies moved slowly, burdened by heavy armor and supply trains, Mongol forces moved with the speed of the wind itself. Where traditional armies fought in rigid formations, the Mongols flowed like water, adapting instantly to changing battlefield conditions. Genghis Khan, the founder of the Mongol Empire, had created more than just an army. He had forged a new kind of society dedicated entirely to conquest. Every aspect of Mongol life was organized around military efficiency. Their decimal system of organization units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors allowed for unprecedented coordination across vast distances. Their messenger system, the Yam, could carry orders from the Great Khan to commanders thousands of miles away in a matter of weeks. Perhaps most importantly, the Mongols had mastered the art of psychological warfare. Their reputation preceded them like a dark shadow, and many cities surrendered without a fight rather than face the terrible fate that awaited those who resisted. The Mongols cultivated this fear deliberately, understanding that an enemy defeated in his own mind was already half conquered. By 1258, 2 years before our story's climax, the Mongols had achieved what many considered impossible. They had captured Baghdad, the jewel of the Islamic world and seat of the Abbasid Caliphate. The city that had been the center of learning and culture for the Islamic world for over 5 centuries fell to the Mongol general Hulagu Khan in a siege that lasted only 12 days. The fall of Baghdad sent shockwaves throughout the medieval world. If the city of peace, as Baghdad was known, could fall so quickly to the Mongol war machine, what hope did any other city have? The Mongols had not merely conquered Baghdad. They had devastated it so thoroughly that the city would never fully recover its former glory. Libraries containing centuries of accumulated knowledge were destroyed, their precious manuscripts used to build bridges across the Tigris River. The irrigation systems that had sustained Mesopotamian civilization for millennia were systematically destroyed. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and one of the most capable Mongol commanders, seemed poised to complete what his grandfather had begun: the conquest of the entire known world. After Baghdad, his forces moved steadily westward, capturing Aleppo and Damascus with the same methodical efficiency they had demonstrated throughout their campaigns. The Mongol army that approached the borders of Egypt in early 1260 was the stuff of nightmares for their enemies. Contemporary accounts describe a force so vast that it took days for the entire army to pass a single point. The core of this army consisted of Mongol heavy cavalry, warriors encased in lamellar armor, riding powerful horses bred for both speed and endurance. These were supplemented by light cavalry archers whose mobility and accuracy had broken armies across 2 continents. But Hulagu's force was more than just Mongol warriors. The Mongol genius for incorporating the best military techniques and technologies from conquered peoples meant that their army included Chinese siege engineers, Muslim cavalry from Central Asia, Armenian infantry, and Georgian auxiliaries. It was a truly international force united under Mongol command and discipline. Leading the vanguard of this magnificent army was Kitbuka, a Nestorian Christian who had become one of Hulagu's most trusted generals. Kitbuka was everything the Mongols valued in a commander: utterly fearless in battle, brilliant in tactics, and absolutely loyal to his Khan. Under his command were approximately 20,000 of the finest warriors in the Mongol Empire, a force that by all rights should have been more than sufficient to complete the conquest of the Middle East. As this army approached the borders of Mamluk Egypt, the reaction across the region was one of barely controlled panic. The Mongols had never been truly defeated in a major engagement. They had suffered setbacks, certainly, and individual battles had not always gone their way. But no army had ever broken their power or forced them into genuine retreat. In the courts of Europe, Christian rulers watched with a mixture of hope and terror. Some saw the Mongols as potential allies against the Muslim powers that controlled the Holy Land. Others recognized that if the Mongols completed their westward expansion, European Christendom itself might be next. The Pope himself had sent envoys to the Mongol courts, seeking to understand the intentions of these fearsome warriors from the east. In the Islamic world, the approach of the Mongols was seen as nothing less than an existential threat. The destruction of Baghdad had demonstrated that no city, no matter how holy or well fortified, was safe from their advance. Many Muslim rulers began to consider the unthinkable: submission to Mongol overlordship as the price of survival. But in Cairo, Sultan Qutuz made a different choice. Rather than submit or flee, he began to prepare for war. The year 1259 had been one of constant tension in the Mamluk capital of Cairo. Reports from the east grew more ominous with each passing month. First came news of the fall of Aleppo, then Damascus. Refugees began streaming into Egypt, carrying tales of Mongol ruthlessness and military invincibility that chilled the blood of even the most experienced warriors. Sultan Qutuz faced a decision that would determine not just his own fate, but potentially the future of Islam itself. He could follow the example of so many other rulers and seek accommodation with the Mongols, hoping that submission might at least preserve some semblance of his kingdom. Or he could choose to fight, knowing that failure would likely mean not just his own death, but the complete destruction of the Mamluk state. For Qutuz, this was never really a choice at all. The Mamluk system had created warriors who viewed honor and courage as more precious than life itself. To submit without fighting would be to deny everything the Mamluks represented. Moreover, Qutuz possessed something that many other rulers lacked: genuine confidence in his army's abilities. The Mamluk military system was, in its own way, as revolutionary as that of the Mongols. While the Mongols had perfected the art of mobile warfare on the open steppes, the Mamluks had developed tactics specifically suited to the varied terrain of the Middle East. They were equally comfortable fighting in desert sands, river valleys, or mountainous regions. Their training emphasized adaptability and individual excellence within a framework of disciplined cooperation. Throughout the winter of 1259 and the early months of 1260, Cairo buzzed with military preparations. The great training grounds outside the city echoed with the sounds of weapons practice as Mamluk warriors honed their already formidable skills to an even finer edge. Blacksmiths worked day and night forging weapons and armor, while fletchers produced thousands of arrows for the coming campaign. But Qutuz understood that defeating the Mongols would require more than just military preparation. He needed to unite his forces psychologically, to convince them that they could achieve what no other army had managed: a decisive victory over the seemingly invincible Mongol war machine. One of Qutuz's most inspired decisions was to recall Baibars al-Bunduktari from exile. Baibars was perhaps the most gifted military tactician among the Mamluks, a warrior whose reputation for cunning and ferocity was legendary throughout the medieval world. However, he had fallen out with the previous Mamluk leadership and been forced into exile among the Ayyubid rulers of Syria. The relationship between Qutuz and Baibars was complex and, as events would prove, ultimately tragic. Both men were brilliant commanders, but they represented different philosophies of leadership. Qutuz was the more traditional Mamluk leader, honorable, straightforward, and deeply committed to the Brotherhood's ideals. Baibars was more pragmatic, willing to use any means necessary to achieve victory, and possessed of an ambition that sometimes conflicted with Mamluk traditions of loyalty. Nevertheless, Qutuz recognized that defeating the Mongols would require every advantage the Mamluks could muster, and there was no denying Baibars' military genius. When Baibars arrived in Cairo in early 1260, he brought with him not just his own formidable skills, but also detailed intelligence about Mongol tactics and weaknesses gleaned from years of fighting against their forces in Syria. Together, Qutuz and Baibars began to develop a strategy that played to Mamluk strengths while exploiting what they believed to be Mongol vulnerabilities. The Mongols excelled in open battle where their superior numbers and mobility could be brought to bear. But the Mamluks had observed that Mongol forces, for all their adaptability, sometimes struggled when faced with unexpected tactical innovations or when drawn into terrain that negated their mobility advantages. The Mamluks also possessed one crucial advantage that often goes unmentioned in military histories: superior intelligence gathering. The Mamluk state had developed an extensive network of spies and informants throughout Syria and Mesopotamia. While the Mongols certainly had their own intelligence operations, they were operating in foreign territory among populations that had little reason to love their conquerors. Through this intelligence network, Qutuz and Baibars learned that Hulagu Khan himself had returned to Mongolia to participate in the selection of a new great Khan following the death of Monk Khan in 1259. This meant that the Mongol forces in Syria, while still formidable, were significantly smaller than they might have been if Hulagu had remained to complete the conquest personally. More importantly, they learned the identity and character of the Mongol commander who had been left to complete the conquest of Egypt, Kitbuka. While Kitbuka was undoubtedly a skilled general, he was also known for his personal courage to the point of recklessness. Unlike many Mongol commanders, who preferred to direct battles from positions of relative safety, Kitbuka had a reputation for leading from the front, inspiring his troops through personal example. To most medieval commanders, this would have seemed like a formidable advantage for the Mongols. But Qutuz and Baibars saw an opportunity. A commander who felt compelled to lead from the front might be vulnerable to tactical maneuvers designed to isolate him from his forces. If they could somehow turn Kitbuka's courage against him, they might achieve what no army had yet managed: the elimination of a senior Mongol commander in battle. As spring turned to summer in 1260, the tempo of preparations in Cairo increased. Qutuz had managed to assemble what was, by medieval standards, a substantial army. Contemporary sources vary in their estimates, but most historians believe the Mamluk force numbered somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 warriors. This was smaller than Kitbuka's army, but not impossibly so. More importantly, it was an army of exceptional quality. The corps consisted of royal Mamluks, the elite guard units personally loyal to the Sultan. These were warriors who had been training together for years, who knew each other's capabilities intimately, and who shared an almost mystical belief in their collective invincibility. Supporting them were provincial Mamluks from throughout Egypt, Kurdish cavalry units, Bedouin auxiliaries, and even some European Crusader knights who had decided that the Mongol threat superseded religious differences. But armies are more than just collections of warriors, and Qutuz understood that victory would require more than just military prowess. He spent considerable time and effort ensuring that his forces were united not just tactically, but spiritually and psychologically. Islamic scholars were brought in to remind the warriors that they fought not just for the Mamluk state, but for the survival of their faith. The parallels to the early Islamic conquests were deliberately emphasized once again. The faithful faced a seemingly impossible challenge, and once again, divine favor would determine the outcome. As the summer heat intensified and reports arrived that Kitbuka's forces were moving through Syria toward the Egyptian border, Qutuz made perhaps his most crucial decision. Rather than wait for the Mongols to invade Egypt and fight a defensive campaign, he would take the offensive and meet them in Palestine. This was an enormously risky decision that flew in the face of conventional military wisdom. Egypt's borders were naturally defensible, and the Mamluks could have forced the Mongols to attack fortified positions while operating at the end of extended supply lines. By choosing to fight in Palestine, Qutuz was essentially accepting battle on terms that favored Mongol mobility and tactical flexibility. But the Sultan's reasoning was sound, even if it was dangerous. A defensive campaign would require the Mamluks to absorb the first Mongol assault, and history had shown that few armies survived the initial shock of the Mongol attack. By taking the offensive, Qutuz hoped to dictate the time and place of battle, potentially catching the Mongols before they were fully prepared for a major engagement. Moreover, fighting in Palestine offered certain advantages. The terrain there was more varied than the open desert approaches to Egypt, potentially limiting Mongol mobility. More importantly, a victory in Palestine would prevent the war from reaching Egyptian soil, preserving the Mamluk homeland from the devastation that inevitably followed Mongol conquest. In August 1260, as the heat of summer reached its peak, Sultan Qutuz led his army out of Cairo and north toward Palestine. Behind him, the great city fell silent as its population waited to learn whether their sultan would return victorious or whether they would soon face the same fate as Baghdad and Damascus. The stage was set for what would become one of the most significant battles in human history, a confrontation that would determine whether the Mongol tide would continue its seemingly inexorable flow westward or whether, for the first time, it would break against an immovable obstacle. The summer of 1260 in the Levant was particularly brutal, with temperatures soaring and the sun beating down mercilessly on the ancient roads that connected Egypt to Syria. As Sultan Qutuz's army made its way north from Cairo, the very landscape seemed to shimmer with the heat of anticipation. This was more than just another military campaign. It was a march toward a destiny that would reshape the medieval world. Qutuz had chosen his route carefully, following the ancient coastal road that had carried armies for millennia, the same path taken by Alexander the Great, by the Roman legions, by Saladin's forces during the Crusades. Each step northward took the Mamluk army deeper into territory that had recently been conquered by the Mongols, land where the local population had already begun to adapt to their new overlords. The psychological challenge facing Qutuz was immense. His warriors were marching not just toward battle, but toward a confrontation with an enemy that had achieved mythical status. For over half a century, the Mongols had been portrayed in both popular imagination and scholarly accounts as an unstoppable force of nature. To march directly toward such an enemy required a level of confidence and determination that few medieval armies possessed. Yet contemporary accounts suggest that Mamluk morale remained remarkably high during this crucial march. The warriors sang as they rode, their voices carrying ancient songs of valor and victory across the desert air. Qutuz himself was frequently seen moving among his troops, sharing their hardships and reinforcing the bonds of brotherhood that made the Mamluk military system so effective. The Sultan's decision-making during this period reveals the careful balance between confidence and caution that characterized his leadership. While he was committed to seeking battle with Kitbuka's forces, he was not reckless about it. Advanced scouts ranged far ahead of the main army, gathering intelligence about Mongol movements and positions. Supply lines were carefully maintained, ensuring that the army would not be caught at a disadvantage due to lack of provisions or equipment. Meanwhile, Kitbuka and his Mongol forces were advancing south from Damascus with their characteristic efficiency and confidence. The Mongol general had spent months consolidating his control over Syria, accepting the submission of local rulers and establishing the administrative systems that would incorporate these new territories into the broader Mongol Empire. For Kitbuka, the campaign against Egypt represented the culmination of decades of Mongol expansion in the region. He had served under Hulagu during the conquest of Baghdad and had witnessed firsthand the collapse of what had once seemed like impregnable fortresses and unbeatable armies. From his perspective, the Mamluks represented just another obstacle to be overcome through the application of proven Mongol military techniques. The Mongol commander's confidence was not misplaced. His army represented the cream of the Mongol military establishment in the region, hardened veterans who had participated in conquests stretching from China to the Mediterranean. They moved with the disciplined precision that had become the hallmark of Mongol military operations, their supply trains organized with mathematical precision, their scouts providing a constant stream of intelligence about terrain and enemy movements. But Kitbuka may have underestimated the unique challenges posed by the Mamluks. Unlike the settled populations of Mesopotamia or Syria, the Mamluks were a military society that lived for warfare. They had spent their entire lives preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. Moreover, they were fighting not just for territory or political advantage, but for their very existence as a people and a faith. As the two armies converged on the plains of Palestine in late August 1260, both commanders were acutely aware that the coming battle would be unlike any that had preceded it. Previous Mongol conquests had often been decided by siege warfare, with the Mongols systematically reducing fortified positions until local resistance collapsed. But this would be a battle between two highly mobile field armies, each confident in its tactical superiority and fighting for stakes that could not be higher. The actual location where these two forces would meet was determined by a combination of strategic calculation and geographical inevitability. The coastal plain of Palestine offered the kind of open terrain that both armies preferred for major engagements, while the surrounding hills and valleys provided opportunities for tactical maneuver that skilled commanders on both sides hoped to exploit. Qutuz's choice of Ain Jalut, the Spring of Goliath, as the site for his army's concentration was laden with symbolic meaning that was not lost on his Muslim warriors. This was the same region where, according to biblical and Islamic tradition, the young David had faced the giant Goliath, using skill and divine favor to overcome seemingly impossible odds. The parallel to the current situation was obvious and inspirational. As the Mamluk army established its positions near Ain Jalut, Qutuz implemented a deception that would prove crucial to the battle's outcome. Rather than displaying his full strength, he kept the majority of his forces concealed in the hills surrounding the valley, showing only a relatively small force to Mongol scouts. This created the impression that the Mamluk army was smaller than it actually was, potentially encouraging Kitbuka to attack with less caution than he might otherwise have shown. The deception required remarkable discipline from the concealed Mamluk units. For hours, they remained hidden in the scorching heat, their horses kept quiet through careful management, and their weapons ready for instant deployment. The psychological pressure on these warriors must have been enormous. They could hear the sounds of the approaching Mongol army but could not see their enemies or gauge their strength. Baibars, whose tactical genius would prove crucial in the coming battle, used this time to conduct a final reconnaissance of the battlefield. Moving with a small group of trusted companions, he personally surveyed the terrain where the battle would be fought, identifying key features that could be used to advantage and potential points of vulnerability in both armies' positions. Contemporary sources describe Baibars during this period as a man transformed by the approaching battle. Always known for his intensity and focus, he now displayed an almost supernatural level of concentration, as if he could already visualize the flow of the coming engagement. His subordinates later reported that he seemed to have considered every possible development, every potential tactical variation that might arise during the battle. As September 3rd, 1260 dawned, both armies completed their preparations for what all understood would be a decisive encounter. The Mongols, confident in their tactical superiority and experienced in victory, arranged themselves in the traditional formations that had brought them success across two continents. Their heavy cavalry formed the center of their line, supported by the mobile archers who had broken so many enemy formations. Kitbuka himself took a position where he could observe the entire battlefield while remaining close enough to influence the fighting directly. The visible Mamluk forces, under Qutuz's direct command, arranged themselves in a formation that appeared conventional but concealed several tactical innovations. Unlike many medieval armies, which fought in rigid formations that changed little during the course of battle, the Mamluks had developed a more flexible approach that allowed units to adapt quickly to changing circumstances. As the morning sun climbed higher and the heat began to build across the Palestinian plain, both armies completed their final preparations. Weapons were checked one last time, armor was adjusted, and final prayers were offered to whatever gods each warrior served. The Mongols performed their traditional pre-battle rituals, calling upon the spirits of their ancestors to grant them victory. The Mamluks recited verses from the Quran, reminding themselves that they fought in defense of the faith. At approximately 10 in the morning, with the sun bright overhead and a light breeze stirring the dust of the plain, Kitbuka gave the order that would begin one of history's most significant battles. The Mongol war horns sounded their deep, ominous notes across the battlefield, and the greatest cavalry force the world had ever seen began its advance toward what appeared to be a relatively small and outnumbered Mamluk army. But appearances, as the Mongols were about to discover, could be devastatingly deceptive. The morning of September 3rd, 1260, broke clear and hot over the plain of Ain Jalut. As the sun climbed higher into the cloudless sky, its rays caught the polished metal of thousands of weapons and pieces of armor, creating a glittering display that spoke of the deadly purpose gathering on this ancient battlefield. Kitbuka surveyed the Mamluk positions with the practiced eye of a commander who had participated in countless engagements across the breadth of the Mongol Empire. What he saw before him appeared to confirm his expectations. A competent but outnumbered enemy force arranged in conventional formations. The visible Mamluk army seemed to number perhaps 12,000 warriors, smaller than his own force and lacking the tactical innovations that might have given him pause. The Mongol general's confidence was understandable. His army represented the culmination of Mongol military evolution, incorporating lessons learned from decades of conquest. The core of heavy cavalry, warriors encased in lamellar armor and mounted on powerful horses, provided the striking power that had broken enemy centers from China to Eastern Europe. Supporting them were the legendary Mongol horse archers, whose mobility and accuracy had terrorized enemies across 2 continents. But Kitbuka's greatest asset may have been his own experience and that of his subordinate commanders. These were men who had fought in the great campaigns of conquest, who had participated in the sieges of Baghdad and Damascus, who had learned their craft under some of the most successful military leaders in human history. They approached the Battle of Ain Jalut with the supreme confidence of professionals who had never known defeat. As the Mongol army began its advance, their movement displayed the disciplined precision that had become their hallmark. The heavy cavalry maintained perfect formation despite the difficult terrain, while the horse archers moved with fluid grace, ready to rain death upon their enemies at the first opportunity. War drums pounded out a rhythm that had become the funeral march of empires, while horns sounded the deep, haunting notes that had announced Mongol victory from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. Sultan Qutuz, watching the approach of this magnificent army, must have felt the weight of history settling upon his shoulders. He commanded the visible portion of the Mamluk force personally, and his warriors looked to him not just for tactical leadership, but for the kind of inspirational example that would be necessary to face down the seemingly invincible Mongol war machine. The Sultan's appearance at this crucial moment was carefully calculated to inspire maximum confidence among his followers. He wore the finest armor that Mamluk craftsmen could produce, inlaid with gold and inscribed with verses from the Quran. His horse was a magnificent Arabian stallion, bred for both speed and endurance. Most importantly, his bearing conveyed absolute confidence in the righteousness of his cause and the inevitable victory of his forces. As the distance between the 2 armies closed, Qutuz began the first phase of his carefully planned tactical deception. Rather than waiting to receive the Mongol charge, he ordered his visible forces to advance, but in a manner that suggested hesitation and uncertainty. To Mongol observers, it would have appeared that the Mamluk commander was uncertain of his strategy, perhaps even reconsidering his decision to offer battle. This apparent hesitation had precisely the effect Qutuz intended. Kitbuka, seeing what appeared to be weakness or indecision in the enemy ranks, ordered an immediate acceleration of his advance. Rather than the methodical approach that characterized most Mongol attacks, His forces began to move with the kind of aggressive urgency that suggested an opportunity to achieve quick victory. The initial contact between the two forces came as the Mongol horse archers moved within range of the Mamluk formation. These legendary warriors, whose composite bows could send arrows with deadly accuracy over distances that amazed their enemies, began the battle with a devastating shower of projectiles aimed at the Mamluk center. But here the Mongols encountered their first unpleasant surprise. The Mamluks did not break or waver under the arrow storm as so many other armies had done. Instead, they responded with their own archery, revealing a level of skill and equipment that matched or even exceeded that of their opponents. Mamluk composite bows, crafted by masters who had learned their art from the same Central Asian traditions that had armed the Mongols, sent their own deadly rain toward the advancing enemy. More importantly, the Mamluks demonstrated a tactical flexibility that caught the Mongols off guard. Rather than maintaining rigid formations while under arrow attack, Mamluk units began to move and maneuver, presenting constantly shifting targets that made accurate archery far more difficult. Individual Mamluk warriors displayed horsemanship skills that rivaled those of the Mongols themselves, controlling their mounts with precision while maintaining effective return fire. As the archery duel continued, Kitbuka realized that this battle would not be the swift victory he had anticipated. The enemy before him was demonstrating levels of skill and discipline that he had rarely encountered. Nevertheless, his confidence remained high. The Mongols possessed one crucial advantage that had served them well in countless previous engagements: superior numbers and the ability to sustain combat longer than most opponents. The Mongol general's next move followed classical steppe tactics. He ordered his heavy cavalry to advance in the center while his lighter forces attempted to envelop the Mamluk flanks. This was the classic Mongol battle plan that had proven devastatingly effective against armies from Europe to Asia. Pin the enemy center with heavy cavalry while mobile forces struck at the flanks and rear, creating chaos and confusion that would lead to complete collapse. The thunder of hooves across the Palestinian plain was unlike anything the local landscape had witnessed in centuries. Thousands of heavily armored horses carrying the finest warriors in the Mongol Empire charged across the dusty ground, their riders' lances leveled and their battle cries echoing across the valley. The very earth seemed to shake under the impact of their advance, and dust clouds rose high into the morning air. But as the Mongol heavy cavalry closed in on the Mamluk center, Qutuz sprung the first part of his elaborate tactical trap. At what appeared to be the last possible moment, he ordered his visible forces to begin a fighting withdrawal, pulling back in apparent disorder while continuing to offer resistance. To the advancing Mongols, this would have looked like the beginning of enemy collapse, exactly the kind of development that had preceded so many previous victories. Kitbuka, seeing what appeared to be the enemy center beginning to crumble, committed more forces to exploiting this apparent breakthrough. Additional cavalry units that he might have held in reserve were sent forward to complete what looked like an impending victory. The Mongol flanking forces, meanwhile, encountered their own apparent success as Mamluk units on both wings also began to pull back. What the Mongols did not realize was that they were being drawn deeper into a carefully prepared killing ground. The Mamluk withdrawal was not a collapse, but a calculated maneuver designed to separate the Mongol forces from their supports and expose them to attacks from unexpected directions. Every step that Qutuz's visible forces retreated brought the Mongols closer to the concealed positions where the main Mamluk army waited. The moment of revelation came with devastating suddenness. As the pursuing Mongol cavalry crested a low ridge in their pursuit of the apparently fleeing Mamluks, they found themselves looking down into a valley where thousands of fresh enemy warriors emerged from concealment. The hidden portions of the Mamluk army, which had waited with superhuman patience through hours of rising tension, finally revealed themselves in all their deadly splendor. Contemporary accounts describe this moment as one of the most dramatic reversals in military history. In an instant, what had appeared to be a Mongol victory transformed into a potential disaster. Instead of pursuing a broken enemy, Kitbuka's forces found themselves surrounded by fresh troops in superior numbers, fighting in terrain that negated many of their traditional advantages. Baibars, commanding the largest of the concealed Mamluk forces, led his warriors in a charge that contemporary chroniclers compared to an avalanche. These were the finest heavy cavalry in the Mamluk army, warriors who had trained for exactly this moment their entire adult lives. Their impact on the exposed Mongol flank was devastating, sending shockwaves through the previously confident enemy formation. The battle now transformed from a conventional engagement into something approaching chaos, but it was chaos that favored the Mamluks. They had prepared for exactly this kind of confused, multi-directional fighting, while the Mongols found their usual tactical advantages neutralized by the confined terrain and the presence of enemy forces in every direction. Kitbuka, recognizing the desperate nature of his position, made a decision that revealed both his courage and his tactical acumen. Rather than attempt a withdrawal that might have preserved some of his forces but would have handed the Mamluks a complete victory, he chose to commit everything to a final, desperate assault aimed at breaking through the enemy encirclement. The Mongol general's personal charge became the stuff of legend. Contemporary sources describe him fighting with superhuman fury, his sword cutting down enemy after enemy as he attempted to rally his scattered forces and create a path to safety. His personal courage was so remarkable that even Mamluk chroniclers, writing years after the battle, spoke of him with genuine admiration. But courage alone could not overcome the tactical disadvantage in which the Mongols now found themselves. Qutuz had achieved what no previous commander had managed. He had created a situation where Mongol mobility and numerical advantages were neutralized, where the battle would be decided by individual fighting skill and unit cohesion rather than by the grand tactical maneuvers that typically determined the outcome of medieval battles. In this kind of fighting, the Mamluks held crucial advantages. Their training emphasized individual combat excellence within a framework of small unit cooperation. Each Mamluk warrior was not just a skilled fighter but a member of a brotherhood that had drilled together for years. They knew each other's capabilities intimately and could coordinate their efforts with a precision that rivaled that of the Mongols themselves. Moreover, the Mamluks fought with the desperate intensity of men who knew that defeat meant not just death, but the end of their entire way of life. They were not fighting for conquest or plunder, but for survival itself. This psychological advantage proved crucial in the savage hand-to-hand combat that now raged across the battlefield. As the battle reached its climax, both commanders found themselves personally engaged in the fighting. Qutuz, true to Mamluk tradition, led from the front, his presence inspiring his warriors to ever greater efforts. Kitbuka, equally committed to the warrior ethic of his own people, fought with the fury of a man who knew that defeat was approaching but was determined to sell his life as dearly as possible. The decisive moment came when Baibars, leading a concentrated charge by the elite royal Mamluks, broke through the last organized Mongol resistance and engaged Kitbuka himself in personal combat. Contemporary accounts of this encounter vary in their details, but all agree on the outcome. The Mongol general, fighting to the last against impossible odds, was struck down by Baibar's own sword. The death of Kitbuka marked the collapse of organized Mongol resistance. Without their charismatic leader, and scattered across a battlefield that offered little opportunity for coordinated action, the remaining Mongol forces began to break and flee. But the Mamluks, understanding the historical significance of this moment, were not content with mere victory. They pursued the fleeing Mongols with relentless determination, turning defeat into complete disaster. The pursuit continued for miles across the Palestinian countryside, with Mamluk cavalry hunting down fleeing enemies with the same methodical efficiency that the Mongols had once displayed in their own conquests. By the time the sun set on September 3, 1260, the greatest Mongol army ever assembled in the western regions of their empire had been not just defeated, but virtually annihilated. Contemporary estimates suggest that fewer than 1,000 Mongol warriors escaped the disaster at Ain Jalut. The rest were either killed in the battle itself or hunted down during the pursuit that followed. For the first time in over half a century, a Mongol army had not just been defeated but completely destroyed, its survivors too few to maintain any meaningful military presence in the region. The immediate aftermath of the battle was almost as dramatic as the engagement itself. As word of the Mongol defeat spread throughout Syria and Mesopotamia, populations that had recently submitted to Mongol rule began to rise in rebellion. Cities that had opened their gates to Mongol armies now closed them against fleeing Mongol survivors. The entire political and military structure that Hulagu had so carefully constructed began to crumble with astonishing speed. For Qutuz and his victorious Mamluks, the triumph at Ain Jalut represented vindication of everything they represented as a military and political system. They had faced the ultimate test, confrontation with the most successful military force in medieval history, and had not just survived but achieved complete victory. The slaves who had risen to become kings had proven themselves worthy of their elevated status. But even in the moment of greatest triumph, the seeds of tragedy were already beginning to sprout. Baibars, whose tactical genius had been crucial to the victory, looked upon his sultan with eyes that had already begun to calculate new possibilities. The man who had helped Qutuz achieve immortal glory would soon ensure that the sultan would not live to enjoy it. The weeks following the Battle of Ain Jalut were marked by scenes that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Across Syria, Mesopotamia, and Palestine, Mongol garrisons that had appeared unshakable suddenly found themselves besieged by rebellious populations emboldened by news of the great victory. The psychological impact of the Mamluk triumph proved almost as devastating to Mongol power as the military defeat itself. Sultan Qutuz, now hailed as the savior of Islam and the breaker of Mongol invincibility, moved swiftly to consolidate his stunning victory. Rather than returning immediately to Cairo to celebrate, he pressed forward into Syria, determined to reclaim all the territories that the Mongols had recently conquered. This decision demonstrated both his strategic wisdom and his understanding of the unique historical moment he now commanded. The Mamluk army that advanced into Syria bore little resemblance to the force that had marched north from Cairo just weeks earlier. Victory had transformed them from skilled but untested warriors into legendary figures whose very presence was enough to inspire terror in their enemies and hope in their allies. They moved with the confidence of men who had achieved the impossible and who now understood that no enemy, no matter how formidable, was truly invincible. Damascus, the jewel of Syria, fell to the Mamluks without a struggle. The Mongol garrison, demoralized by news of Kitbuk's defeat and isolated hundreds of miles from the nearest reinforcements, simply melted away as Qutuz's forces approached. The city's population, which had submitted to Mongol rule with resignation just months earlier, now welcomed the Mamluks as liberators. The scenes in Damascus as Qutuz entered the ancient city must have been extraordinary. Here was the man who had accomplished what no other medieval ruler had managed the complete defeat of a major Mongol army in open battle. The city's mosques rang with prayers of thanksgiving, while scholars and poets competed to create works commemorating the great victory. But perhaps more significantly, practical politicians and merchants throughout the region began to recalculate their loyalties and alliances. The Mongol Empire had seemed like the inevitable future of the medieval world, a reality that ambitious men ignored at their peril. Now, suddenly, that future looked far less certain. The Mamluks had proven that Mongol power had limits, and ambitious individuals throughout the region began to consider the implications. Aleppo, the other great prize of northern Syria, also fell to the advancing Mamluks without significant resistance. Here, too, the Mongol garrison chose discretion over valor, withdrawing eastward toward the relative safety of Mesopotamia rather than attempting to hold positions that had become strategically untenable. As Qutuz consolidated his control over the reconquered territories, he demonstrated the administrative capabilities that had made the Mamluk system so effective. Rather than simply occupying Syrian cities as a conqueror, he began immediately to restore the governmental and commercial structures that had been disrupted by the Mongol conquest. Trade routes were reopened, local leaders were confirmed in their positions, and the complex system of taxation and administration that sustained medieval urban civilization was restored. This administrative efficiency was crucial to the long-term success of the Mamluk expansion. Military victory was only the first step in creating a stable political system. The real test lay in governing the conquered territories effectively enough to maintain their loyalty and productivity. In this challenge, the Mamluks demonstrated the same competence they had shown on the battlefield. But even as Qutuz worked to consolidate his conquests and establish the Mamluk Sultanate as the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean, tensions were growing within his own ranks. The victory at Ain Jalut had been a collective achievement, but the glory that followed was inevitably concentrated on the figure of the Sultan himself. For ambitious commanders like Baibars, this concentration of credit and power created both opportunities and resentments. Baibars had played a crucial role in the great victory, and he was certainly recognized for his contributions. But recognition and reward were not the same thing as real power, and Baibars was a man whose ambitions extended far beyond military glory. He began to gather around himself a group of supporters who shared his belief that the Mamluk state could be even more effectively led under different leadership. The tragedy that was approaching became inevitable when Qutuz made what would prove to be a fatal error in judgment. Believing that his great victory had secured his position permanently, he began to act with the kind of independence and authority that conflicted with traditional Mamluk concepts of collective leadership. The brotherhood that had made the Mamluks so effective began to fracture under the pressure of success. On October 24, 1260, less than 2 months after his greatest triumph, Sultan Qutuz was assassinated while returning from his successful Syrian campaign. The deed was carried out by Baibars and his fellow conspirators during a hunting expedition, in a manner that ensured there would be no survivors to contest their version of events. The official justification for the assassination was that Qutuz had become tyrannical and had begun to act contrary to Mamluk traditions and interests. But contemporary sources suggest that the real motivation was far simpler. Baibars and his supporters believed that they could govern the Mamluk state more effectively than Qutuz, and they were not willing to wait for a natural transfer of power. The assassination of Qutuz represents one of history's most tragic ironies. The man who had saved the Islamic world from Mongol conquest, who had broken the myth of Mongol invincibility, who had established the Mamluk Sultanate as a major power, was struck down by the very system that had made his achievements possible. The Mamluk tradition of advancement through merit and military prowess, which had created the opportunity for Qutuz's rise, also created the justification for his elimination. Baibars, who assumed power immediately after Qutuz's death, proved to be an extraordinarily capable ruler who would lead the Mamluks to even greater heights. Under his leadership, the Mamluks would complete the expulsion of the Crusaders from the Holy Land and establish themselves as the undisputed masters of the Eastern Mediterranean. But his rise to power through assassination created precedents that would haunt the Mamluk state throughout its existence. The legacy of the Battle of Ain Jalut, however, transcended the personal tragedies that followed it. For the first time in over half a century, a major Mongol army had been not just defeated but completely destroyed. The myth of Mongol invincibility, which had been one of their most powerful weapons, lay shattered on the plains of Palestine. The news of Qutuz's defeat and death traveled across the medieval world with a speed that would have impressed even modern communications networks. Within weeks, the stunning outcome of the Battle of Ain Jalut was being discussed in the courts of Europe, the palaces of Asia, and the councils of Africa. The psychological impact of this single engagement would reshape the political and military calculations of rulers from England to China. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the most dramatic changes occurred in the territories that had recently fallen under Mongol control. Throughout Syria, Palestine, and even parts of Mesopotamia, local populations that had resigned themselves to Mongol rule suddenly found their courage returning. If the seemingly invincible Mongol war machine could be broken by the Mamluks, perhaps other forms of resistance were also possible. The speed with which Mongol control collapsed in the region was unprecedented. Garrisons that had controlled major cities with confidence just weeks earlier suddenly found themselves isolated and vulnerable. Many chose to withdraw eastward rather than risk being trapped by rebellious populations and advancing Mamluk forces. The entire western expansion of the Mongol Empire, which had seemed irreversible just months before, was suddenly thrown into reverse. But the impact of Ain Jalut extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. The battle had demonstrated that the Mongol military system, impressive as it was not infallible. It could be studied, understood, and countered by opponents who possessed sufficient skill, courage, and determination. This lesson was absorbed by military leaders throughout the medieval world, fundamentally changing how they approached the challenge of confronting Mongol power. In Europe, where Mongol invasions had terrorized populations from Poland to Hungary, the news of the Mamluk victory was received with a mixture of relief and renewed hope. European military leaders began to study accounts of the battle, seeking to understand how the Mamluks had achieved what no European army had managed. The tactical innovations displayed at Ain Jalut would influence European military thinking for generations. The impact was particularly significant in the Byzantine Empire, which had watched the Mongol advance across the Middle East with mounting terror. The Byzantines, heirs to the Roman military tradition but weakened by centuries of conflict, had been preparing for what seemed like inevitable Mongol invasion. The Mamluk victory suddenly provided them with breathing room and a potential ally in their struggle for survival. In the Islamic world, the psychological impact of Ain Jalut was even more profound. For over half a century, Muslim rulers had watched helplessly as the Mongol war machine demolished the great centers of Islamic civilization. The fall of Baghdad in 1258 had seemed to many like the beginning of the end for Islamic political power. The Mamluk victory suddenly restored confidence in the possibility of successful resistance. Muslim scholars and theologians interpreted the victory as a sign of divine favor, evidence that righteous warfare in defense of the faith could still triumph over apparently superior numbers and technology. This interpretation would influence Islamic military and political thinking for centuries, establishing precedents and expectations that would shape responses to future challenges. Perhaps most significantly, the Battle of Ain Jalut marked the high water mark of Mongol expansion westward. The defeat suffered by Qutuz's forces was so complete, and the subsequent collapse of Mongol control in Syria and Palestine was so rapid, that any immediate prospect of renewed westward expansion was eliminated. The Mongol Empire, which had seemed destined to encompass the entire known world, suddenly found its limits clearly defined. This had profound implications for the future development of both the Mongol Empire and the regions that might otherwise have fallen under its control. The Mongols were forced to consolidate their existing conquests rather than continuing their seemingly inexorable expansion. This shift from conquest to consolidation would eventually contribute to the internal divisions and weakening that would characterize later Mongol history. For the Mamluks themselves, the victory established them as the dominant military power in the Eastern Mediterranean and the recognized leaders of Islamic resistance to foreign invasion. This status would shape their identity and their policies for centuries. The Mamluk state that emerged from Ain Jalut was not just another medieval kingdom, but a military republic dedicated to the defense of Islamic civilization. The economic implications of the battle were equally significant. The Mongol conquest of Mesopotamia and Syria had disrupted trade routes that had carried goods and ideas between Asia and Europe for millennia. The Mamluk reconquest of these territories restored these crucial commercial connections, with Cairo and Damascus once again becoming major centers of international trade. The revival of trade had cultural as well as economic implications. The flow of goods was accompanied by the flow of ideas, technologies, and artistic influences. The Mamluk domains became a crucial bridge between East and West, facilitating the exchange of knowledge that would contribute to developments ranging from military technology to mathematical theory. The battle also had significant implications for the relationship between the Islamic world and Christian Europe. The Crusades, which had dominated the politics of the Eastern Mediterranean for over a century, suddenly took on a different character in the aftermath of Ain Jalut. The Mamluks, having proven their military capabilities against the Mongols, were now in a position to complete what Saladin had begun: the expulsion of the Crusader states from the Holy Land. This shift in the balance of power would influence European politics for generations. The loss of the Crusader states, which followed inevitably from Mamluk military dominance, removed a major focus of European political and military activity. The resources that had been devoted to supporting the Crusades could now be redirected to other purposes, contributing to the political and economic developments that would characterize late medieval Europe. The technological exchange that resulted from the battle also had long-term significance. The Mamluks had demonstrated that they could match and even exceed Mongol military technology, but they were also quick to adopt and improve upon techniques learned from their defeated enemies. This synthesis of military traditions from different cultures would influence the development of warfare throughout the region. As we draw our tale toward its close on this quiet evening, it's important to reflect on what the events of 1260 truly meant for the course of human history. The Battle of Ain Jalut was far more than just another medieval military engagement. It was a turning point that altered the trajectory of civilizations and shaped the world in ways that continue to resonate today. Consider, for a moment, what the world might have looked like if Sultan Qutuz had not chosen to march north from Cairo, if his deception had failed, if Baibars had not emerged from concealment at precisely the right moment. The Mongol Empire, already stretching from China to Eastern Europe, would likely have completed its conquest of the Middle East and North Africa. From there, the path would have been clear for an invasion of Europe itself. The implications of such an alternative history are staggering. European civilization, as we know it, might never have developed. The Renaissance, the Age of Exploration, the Scientific Revolution, all of these crucial developments in human progress were made possible, in part, by the survival of European political and cultural independence. That independence was preserved, though European leaders of the time did not realize it, by the actions of warrior slaves on a dusty plain in Palestine. But the significance of Ain Jalut extends beyond the preservation of particular civilizations. The battle demonstrated something profound about human nature and the possibilities for resistance against seemingly overwhelming odds. The Mamluks faced an enemy that had never been decisively defeated, that possessed superior numbers and resources, and that was led by commanders of proven genius. Yet through courage, skill, and careful planning, they achieved complete victory. This lesson, that determination and competence can overcome apparently hopeless odds, would inspire resistance movements throughout history. From the Spanish resistance to Napoleon to the various struggles against totalitarian regimes in the 20th century, the example of Ain Jalut has provided hope and encouragement to those facing seemingly impossible challenges. The battle also illustrated the importance of military innovation and adaptation. The Mamluks succeeded not by directly confronting Mongol strengths, but by developing tactics and strategies that negated those strengths while maximizing their own advantages. This principle, that military success often depends more on tactical innovation than on raw power, remains relevant in modern strategic thinking. The tragic fate of Sultan Qutuz reminds us of another timeless truth about leadership and power. The very qualities that enable individuals to achieve greatness, ambition, independence, the willingness to take enormous risks, can also create the conditions for their downfall. Qutuz's assassination demonstrates that even the most spectacular achievements cannot guarantee security or permanence for those who accomplish them. Yet Qutuz's legacy transcends his personal fate. In choosing to fight rather than submit, in developing the strategic vision that made victory possible, and in demonstrating the kind of leadership that inspired ordinary soldiers to achieve extraordinary things, he earned a place among history's great commanders. His name may not be as familiar to modern audiences as those of Alexander or Napoleon, but his achievements were no less significant. Baibars, despite his role in Qutuz's assassination, also deserves recognition as one of history's great military leaders. His tactical genius at Ain Jalut and his subsequent achievements in completing the expulsion of the Crusaders established him as one of the most successful commanders of the medieval period. His rise from slavery to supreme power illustrates the remarkable meritocracy that characterized the Mamluk system at its best. The Mamluk military system itself represents one of history's most interesting experiments in creating military excellence through social engineering. By taking young men from their original cultural contexts and forging them into a brotherhood devoted entirely to martial excellence and political loyalty, the Mamluks created a military elite that was arguably superior to any other fighting force of its era. This system had its obvious moral problems. It was built on slavery, after all, and it perpetuated itself through the systematic separation of children from their families. But it also demonstrated that military and political excellence could be cultivated rather than simply inherited, that talent and dedication could overcome accidents of birth, and that properly organized training and education could create capabilities that exceeded what natural talent alone could achieve. The broader historical context of Ain Jalut also deserves our attention. The 13th century was a period of unprecedented change and upheaval across the known world. The Mongol conquests had disrupted traditional political and cultural patterns from Eastern Asia to Eastern Europe. Trade routes that had operated for centuries were altered or destroyed. Ancient centers of learning and culture were devastated. Traditional forms of government and social organization were swept away. In this context of global upheaval, the Mamluk victory represented more than just the survival of one particular political system. It demonstrated that adaptation and innovation could enable societies to survive and even thrive in the face of revolutionary change. The Mamluks succeeded not by trying to preserve the past unchanged, but by creating new forms of organization that were better suited to changed circumstances. The religious dimension of the conflict also carries enduring significance. While it would be wrong to interpret Ain Jalut simply as a religious war, both sides included warriors of various faiths, and political and economic considerations were as important as religious ones. The battle did represent a crucial moment in the survival of Islamic civilization. The destruction of Baghdad had seemed to many Muslims like the beginning of the end for their civilization. The Mongol advance appeared unstoppable, and the possibility that Islamic political and cultural autonomy might be permanently eliminated seemed very real. The Mamluk victory restored confidence in the future of Islamic civilization and provided the foundation for its continued development and expansion. This is not to suggest that the victory was necessarily positive for all concerned. The Mamluk success meant the continuation of conflicts that might otherwise have ended, the perpetuation of political divisions that might otherwise have been resolved, and the maintenance of cultural and religious barriers that might otherwise have been transcended. As we approach the end of our journey through this remarkable chapter of history, it's worth considering how the events of 1260 continued to influence the world long after the last echoes of battle had faded from the plains of Palestine. The Battle of Ain Jalut was not an isolated incident, but rather a pivotal moment whose consequences would ripple through centuries of subsequent history. In the immediate decades following the battle, the Mamluks consolidated their position as the dominant power in the eastern Mediterranean through a series of campaigns that completed what Qutuz had begun. Under Baibars and his successors, they systematically eliminated the remaining Crusader states, capturing the great fortress cities of Antioch, Tripoli, and finally Acre in 1291. This achievement, which had eluded Muslim leaders for nearly 2 centuries, was made possible by the confidence and momentum gained from the victory over the Mongols. The Mamluk state that emerged from these conquests was unlike any that had preceded it in the Islamic world. It was a military republic in the truest sense, governed by an elite that had earned its position through proven competence in warfare rather than through inherited privilege. This system, for all its limitations and internal tensions, proved remarkably effective at maintaining stability and prosperity in a region that had known little of either during the preceding century. The economic revival that followed Mamluk consolidation was particularly significant. The trade routes that connected Asia with Europe, which had been disrupted by decades of warfare and political instability, were restored and protected by Mamluk military power. Cairo and Alexandria became major centers of international commerce once again, while Damascus regained its position as a crucial link in the chain of cities that facilitated east-west trade. This commercial revival had cultural implications that extended far beyond economic matters. The flow of goods was accompanied by the flow of ideas, technologies, and artistic influences. Mamluk domains became a crucial bridge between different civilizations, facilitating exchanges that enriched all the cultures involved. The architectural achievements of the Mamluk period, the mathematical and astronomical works produced by scholars in their territories, and the literary and artistic flowering that occurred under their rule all testified to the creative possibilities that emerged from this cultural synthesis. The military innovations demonstrated at Ain Jalut also had lasting influence on the development of warfare throughout the medieval world. The Mamluk success in countering Mongol tactics encouraged military leaders elsewhere to experiment with new approaches to cavalry warfare, archery techniques, and battlefield coordination. The lessons learned on that September day in 1260 would influence military thinking for generations. Perhaps more importantly, the psychological impact of the Mamluk victory continued to resonate throughout the medieval world. The demonstration that the Mongols could be defeated, that their military system was not invincible, encouraged other societies to resist Mongol expansion more effectively. While the Mongol Empire continued to exist and even to expand in some directions, it never again achieved the kind of psychological dominance that had been one of its most powerful weapons. The relationship between the Islamic world and Christian Europe was also permanently altered by the events following Ain Jalut. The elimination of the Crusader states removed a major source of conflict between the two civilizations, but it also eliminated opportunities for the kind of cultural exchange that had often occurred despite military hostilities. The Mamluk victory thus contributed to a more rigid separation between Islamic and Christian worlds, with consequences that would persist for centuries. The internal development of the Mongol Empire was also significantly affected by the defeat in Palestine. The failure to complete the conquest of the Middle East meant that Mongol resources had to be devoted to defending existing territories rather than expanding into new ones. This shift from offensive to defensive strategic postures contributed to the internal divisions and gradual weakening that would eventually fragment the Mongol Empire into separate successor states. The precedent established by the Mamluks that a well-organized and properly led military force could successfully resist apparently overwhelming odds would inspire military leaders throughout subsequent history. From the Swiss victories over Burgundian armies in the 15th century to the successful resistance movements of the 20th century, the example of Ain Jalut provided evidence that determination and tactical innovation could overcome apparent impossibilities. The story of the Mamluks also illustrates important truths about the relationship between military excellence and political power. The Mamluk system succeeded in creating one of the most effective military forces in medieval history, but this success came at the cost of political stability. The same competitive pressures that maintained military excellence also generated the internal conflicts that would eventually weaken the Mamluk state. The assassination of Qutuz was only the first of many such incidents that would characterize Mamluk history. The system that had created the opportunity for talented individuals to rise from slavery to supreme power also created the conditions under which ambitious individuals would continue to challenge established authority. This dynamic tension between military effectiveness and political stability would define Mamluk civilization throughout its existence. Yet despite these internal tensions, the Mamluk achievement at Ain Jalut stands as one of the great military accomplishments in human history. Against odds that seemed impossible, facing an enemy that had never known decisive defeat, the warrior slaves of Egypt achieved a victory that changed the course of world history. Their success preserved the independence of Islamic civilization, protected European development from Mongol conquest, and demonstrated the continuing possibility of successful resistance to apparently overwhelming power. As the gentle darkness of night settles around you and our tale draws toward its peaceful conclusion, let us take a few final moments to reflect on what we have witnessed in our journey back to that momentous year of 1260. In the quiet of your bedroom, surrounded by the comfort and security of the modern world, it might be difficult to fully appreciate the magnitude of what Sultan Qutuz and his Mamluks accomplished on that dusty plain in Palestine. We live in an age where global powers are balanced by international institutions, where military conflicts are constrained by complex diplomatic frameworks, where the survival of entire civilizations rarely hangs on the outcome of a single battle. But in 1260, none of these modern safeguards existed. The Mongol Empire represented what appeared to be an unstoppable force that would reshape the entire world according to its own vision. The armies that had swept away the Khwarezm Empire, that had humbled China, that had terrorized Europe, that had destroyed Baghdad, seemed destined to complete their conquest of the known world. Against this seemingly inevitable tide stood a collection of warrior slaves who had risen from bondage to create their own kingdom along the banks of the Nile. These Mamluks possessed no ancient legitimacy, no inherited authority, no vast resources beyond what they had earned through their own efforts. What they possessed instead was something far more precious: absolute confidence in their own abilities and unwavering commitment to their shared brotherhood. The victory they achieved at Ain Jalut was more than just a military triumph. It was a vindication of human courage and ingenuity in the face of apparently hopeless odds. Qutuz and Baibars and their warriors demonstrated that careful planning, tactical innovation, and sheer determination could overcome advantages in numbers, resources, and reputation. But our story also reminds us of the fragility of human achievement and the tragic ironies that often accompany great accomplishments. Qutuz, who saved Islamic civilization from Mongol conquest, would not live to see the full fruition of what he had begun. His assassination less than 2 months after his greatest triumph illustrates the harsh realities of political power and the price that leaders sometimes pay for their successes. The relationship between Qutuz and Baibars embodies one of the most enduring themes in human history: the tension between collaboration and competition, between shared purpose and individual ambition. Together, these two remarkable men achieved something that neither could have accomplished alone. Yet their partnership contained within it the seeds of tragedy that would claim the life of one and burden the conscience of the other. Baibars, for all his military genius and subsequent achievements, would carry the stain of his mentor's assassination throughout his career. The same ruthless pragmatism that made him an effective military commander also made him capable of betraying the man who had trusted him with crucial responsibilities. His story reminds us that greatness and moral clarity do not always coincide, that history's most significant figures are often its most complex and morally ambiguous. The Mongol perspective on these events also deserves our consideration. Kitbuka and his warriors were not evil men pursuing wicked goals. They were the representatives of a military and political system that had brought order and stability to vast regions of Asia and Europe. Their defeat represented not just a military setback, but the frustration of what they genuinely believed to be a mission to unify the world under effective governance. The tragedy of Ain Jalut extends beyond the immediate participants to encompass the broader question of what might have been. Would Mongol rule have ultimately proven more beneficial than the fragmented political landscape that actually emerged? Would the unification of Eurasia under a single authority have accelerated human progress and reduced the conflicts that continued to plague the medieval world? These questions have no definitive answers, but they remind us that history rarely presents us with clear choices between good and evil. More often, we are confronted with competing goods, with different visions of human flourishing that cannot easily be reconciled. The Mamluks fought for the preservation of their own civilization and faith, while the Mongols fought for the expansion of what they saw as a superior system of governance and organization. What makes the story of Ain Jalut particularly compelling is that it demonstrates the continuing possibility of human agency in the face of seemingly overwhelming forces. The Mongol Empire appeared to represent historical inevitability, a force so powerful and well-organized that resistance seemed not just futile but almost meaningless. Yet a relatively small group of determined warriors proved that even the most powerful systems contain vulnerabilities that can be exploited by those with sufficient courage and intelligence. This lesson remains relevant in our own time, when we often feel overwhelmed by forces beyond our control: technological change, economic globalization, environmental challenges, political upheavals. The example of the Mamluks reminds us that human initiative and determination can still make a difference, that careful planning and courageous action can still alter outcomes that might otherwise seem predetermined. The technical aspects of the Mamluk victory also offer insights that transcend their immediate historical context. The success of Qutuz's deception at Ain Jalut demonstrates the continuing importance of accurate intelligence, careful planning, and tactical flexibility. The Mamluks succeeded not through superior strength or numbers, but through superior preparation and execution. In our modern world of rapid technological change and complex global challenges, the Mamluk example reminds us that adaptation and innovation often matter more than raw resources. The same principle that allowed warrior slaves to defeat the world's greatest empire, the principle that careful thought and skillful execution can overcome apparent disadvantages, remains as relevant today as it was 7 centuries ago. The cultural and religious dimensions of the story also carry enduring significance. The Battle of Ain Jalut was fought between representatives of different civilizations, each convinced of the righteousness of their cause and the value of their way of life. Yet the battle's aftermath demonstrated that such conflicts, however sincere the convictions on both sides, inevitably carry tragic costs. The Mongol Empire's cosmopolitan tolerance, which had allowed people of different faiths and cultures to coexist within a single political framework, was one of its most admirable features. The Mamluk victory, while preserving Islamic independence, also contributed to the fragmentation that would make future cooperation more difficult. The world that emerged from Ain Jalut was in some ways more diverse and authentic, but it was also more divided and prone to conflict. As we consider the legacy of these events, we might reflect on what the story tells us about the nature of historical progress. The defeat of the Mongols preserved multiple civilizations and cultural traditions that might otherwise have been homogenized under Mongol rule. This preservation of diversity created opportunities for continued cultural exchange and development that enriched human civilization in countless ways. Yet the same fragmentation that preserved diversity also perpetuated conflicts and divisions that continued to generate suffering and waste. The Crusades, which the Mamluks would eventually bring to an end, consumed enormous resources and human lives that might have been devoted to more constructive purposes. The political divisions that the Mamluk victory helped to maintain would continue to complicate efforts at cooperation and peaceful development. The story of Ain Jalut thus embodies both the promise and the tragedy of human history. It demonstrates our capacity for extraordinary achievement in the face of overwhelming odds, but it also illustrates the complex and often unintended consequences of even our greatest triumphs. The warriors who fought on that September day in 1260 could not have foreseen all the ramifications of their actions, just as we cannot fully predict the long-term consequences of our own choices. What they could control, and what they controlled brilliantly, was their response to the immediate challenge before them. Faced with an enemy that appeared invincible, they chose courage over submission, innovation over convention, unity over division. In doing so, they not only achieved victory but also provided an enduring example of human possibility. The peaceful conclusion of our story comes not with the sound of trumpets or the celebration of conquest, but with the quiet satisfaction of understanding. In learning about Qutuz and Baibars, about Kitbuka and his warriors, about the complex forces that brought them together on that fateful day, we have gained insight into the enduring patterns of human experience. The ambitions and fears, the loyalties and betrayals, the moments of transcendent courage and tragic miscalculation that characterize the events of 1260 continue to shape our world today. The individuals who participated in these events were products of their particular time and place, but the fundamental human qualities they displayed, courage, intelligence, determination, ambition, loyalty, treachery, remain constant across the centuries. As you drift towards sleep tonight, perhaps you will carry with you some sense of the extraordinary drama that unfolded more than 7 centuries ago on a plain in Palestine. The dust has long since settled on that ancient battlefield. The warriors who fought there have long since returned to the earth, but the story of their achievement continues to inspire and instruct us. In the darkness of your bedroom, surrounded by the quiet of the modern night, you might reflect on the courage of men who faced seemingly impossible odds and chose to fight anyway. You might consider the tragic complexity of human ambition, which can drive us to great achievements but also to great betrayals. You might ponder the mysterious workings of historical change, which can turn the most carefully laid plans in unexpected directions and create consequences that their originators never intended. But most of all, you might take comfort in the enduring lesson that the Battle of Ain Jalut continues to teach us, that human courage and intelligence, properly applied, can overcome even the most overwhelming challenges. The warrior slaves who rose from bondage to save a civilization remind us that our origins need not determine our destinies, that careful preparation and bold action can still change the course of history, and that even in our darkest moments, the possibility of triumph remains. In this spirit of quiet confidence and peaceful reflection, let us bring our tale to its close. The great Sultan Qutuz sleeps now in the dust of Palestine, his dreams of glory cut short by ambition and betrayal. The brilliant Baibars achieved the power he sought, but carried to his own grave the weight of his mentor's blood. The brave Kitbuka fell as a warrior should, sword in hand, fighting to the end against impossible odds. Their individual stories ended centuries ago, but the larger story of which they were part continues. Each generation faces its own Mongol Empire, its own seemingly invincible challenge that appears to make resistance futile. Each generation must choose between submission and defiance, between accepting what appears inevitable and fighting for what seems impossible. The choice that Qutuz made on that distant September day, the choice to march north from Cairo toward an enemy that had never known defeat, is the same choice that every generation must make in its own way. It is the choice to believe that human agency still matters, that courage and intelligence can still prevail, that the future is not simply something that happens to us, but something we can actively shape. In making that choice and achieving that impossible victory, the Mamluks of 1260 earned their place among history's great heroes. But more than that, they provided an enduring example of human possibility that continues to inspire and guide us. As you close your eyes and let sleep carry you toward your own dreams, you do so in a world that was shaped, in ways both large and small, by the courage of warrior slaves who refused to accept the inevitable and chose instead to fight for the impossible. May their example grant you peaceful sleep and inspiring dreams. May their courage remind you that no challenge is truly insurmountable, no odds truly impossible to overcome. And may their story, like all great stories, live on in your imagination long after the last words have faded into the gentle silence of the night. Thus ends our tale of how the Mamluks dominated the Mongol Empire in 1260, a story of courage and betrayal, of triumph and tragedy, of the eternal human struggle to shape destiny through determination and will. Sleep well and dream of heroes,